The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds of Maylin Santos's small Manila apartment, striping her desk in bands of gold and shadow as she sifted through a stack of half-finished articles. She had been chasing small stories for weeks, the kind that kept her name in print but never stirred her pulse when the phone vibrated against the wood with an unfamiliar number. She almost let it ring out, her fingers hovering over the next page in her notes, but something about the persistence of the call made her answer. The voice on the other end was deep and steady, touched with an accent that spoke of long years in the provinces. He introduced himself as Ramon de la Cruz, a plumber from a rural town in Batangas, and his first words after that carried an edge that made her sit upright. He said he had been hired to replace the septic tank at an old countryside home, a place that had been empty for years, and in the process of draining and dismantling it, he found something he could not ignore. His voice dipped lower as he described the discovery, hesitating before saying he thought it might be connected to a case from the past, the one about the little boy who had vanished without a trace in 1991. Maylin felt her heart give a small, hard thump at the year, the sound echoing in her head like the click of a lock turning. She remembered the old news footage, the grainy image of a toddler with round cheeks and bright eyes, and the tearful parents standing before a wall of microphones pleading for answers that never came. Ramon said he had kept the find to himself at first, unsure who to trust. But the memory of the story had been gnawing at him since he was young, and now, standing in the shadow of what he had uncovered, he could not shake the feeling that the truth was finally within reach. Maylin's pen was already in her hand, the tip moving across the corner of a torn envelope as she asked careful questions, the details sketching themselves in her mind with grim precision. The house where Ramon had been working once belonged to a family who had left the country suddenly in the mid-90s, their property falling into quiet disrepair, and the septic system had not been touched since. What Ramon saw when he opened it, he said, was not something he could explain over the phone. Maylin turned her chair toward the window, looking out at the sprawling tangle of rooftops, her reflection faint in the glass. She could hear in his voice that this was not a bid for attention, or a story invented for drama, but the raw, unsettled truth of someone who had stumbled onto a secret buried too long. She told him she would come in person, her mind already racing ahead to train schedules and the weight of the recorder in her bag, knowing with certainty that whatever waited in that rural yard would change everything. The bus ride to Batangas was long and slow, the kind of journey where the air hung heavy with the scent of dust and diesel, and the view through the smudged window unspooled in shades of green and rust. Maylin Santos kept her notebook balanced on her lap, flipping back to the page where she had scrawled the plumber's name and a few terse lines about what he had found. She had expected Ramon de la Cruz to make her wait when she arrived, but he was already there outside a small roadside eatery, his hands tucked into the pockets of a faded work jacket, eyes scanning the road with the cautious look of someone guarding a truth too big to hold alone. Over plates of garlic rice and strong coffee, he leaned in and told her the name, the one she had not heard spoken aloud since the old television clips of tearful parents and search parties wading through fields. Arjun Tan, he said quietly, and the syllables landed between them with a strange finality, like a bell tolling in a forgotten church. Maylin felt her chest tighten as she remembered the details she had once read in a brittle newspaper clipping, how Arjun had been 3 years old that summer in 1991, how his grandmother had stepped inside the kitchen for only a moment to stir a pot, and when she came back to the yard, the boy was gone. No overturned toys, no footprints in the soft soil beyond the gate, just the drifting echo of children's laughter from somewhere down the road. The searches had lasted for weeks, neighbors combing through fields and rice paddies, volunteers wading through creeks, police dragging nets through shallow ponds. The newspapers from that time had been filled with grainy photographs of the boy, his round cheeks and bright almond-shaped eyes, his hair cut unevenly by his grandmother's careful hand, always smiling in the images, as though he had never imagined a world where someone could take him. As Ramon spoke, Mei Lin could see the memory flickering in his expression too. The way people who had lived in small towns carried these tragedies, as if they were family matters, never entirely fading with the years. He told her that many in the village had believed the boy had been taken, though by whom, and for what reason no one could agree, and over time the silence grew thicker than the truth. Mei Lin's pen scratched against the paper as she asked him to describe the house where he had been working, the septic tank buried in its yard, and how it tied back to the Tans. Ramon said the property had once belonged to a distant relative of Arjun's, though no one spoke of it openly now. Outside, the late afternoon light had softened into the golden haze that made the roadside dust glow, and Mei Lin sat with the weight of the boy's name in her mind, feeling the pull of a story that had been waiting nearly 2 decades for someone to follow it to the end. The road to the property was narrow and uneven, a strip of cracked asphalt winding through the countryside, where banana trees leaned toward the sun, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from nearby kitchens. Mei Lin Santos felt the weight of the journey as she stepped out of the tricycle and looked at the house ahead, its white paint dulled to a sallow cream, the edges of its roof lined with rust. A stray dog lounged in the shade near the gate, lifting its head only briefly as she passed. The current owners, a middle-aged couple who introduced themselves politely but without warmth, agreed to let her look around the yard, though she noticed the guarded way their eyes followed her. The septic tank was gone now, replaced with a fresh slab of cement that was lighter in color than the surrounding stonework, as if the earth itself had not yet settled from its disturbance. The back of the house bore other oddities, details that did not seem to fit the age of the structure, such as a section of wall where the wood grain ran in a different direction, its varnish glossier than the weathered boards beside it, and a window that had clearly been sealed from the inside, its frame painted over in haste. Mei Lin ran her hand over the uneven surface, feeling the ripple of nails driven at strange intervals, and thought about what people choose to cover when they want the past to stay hidden. The garden was sparse, a few wilted plants and patches of earth where something had been dug up and left bare. Inside, the air was cooler but held a faint dampness that clung to the corners, the scent of plaster and old rainwater. She saw mismatched floor tiles in the kitchen, a strip of new ceramic cutting sharply across the older discolored ones. And when she asked casually about renovations, the woman of the house replied that small repairs had been done over the years, but could not recall exactly when or why. In the living room, a family portrait hung slightly askew, the nail above it driven deep into fresh plaster, and behind the frame, Mei Lin glimpsed a faint outline where another, larger picture might once have been. It was the kind of detail that might have meant nothing to someone passing through, but to Mei Lin, it felt like a missing tooth in an otherwise fixed smile. She took slow steps through the rooms, her notebook open, the tip of her pen hovering as she let the atmosphere of the place settle into her senses. The hum of a ceiling fan mixed with the distant clatter of a passing jeepney, sounds that might have seemed ordinary anywhere else but here, layered over the knowledge of what had been found beneath the yard, they pressed in like whispers in an empty hallway. As she stepped back outside, the sky had shifted toward a dim orange, and the house stood against it in quiet defiance, as though it had learned long ago how to keep its secrets buried. Ramon de la Cruz sat across from Mei Lin at a small roadside carinderia, the steam from their coffee curling between them, as he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of something he wished he had never seen. He told her how he had been called to replace the old septic tank at the countryside house, expecting nothing more than the usual sludge, grit, and the occasional lost toy or bottle cap that often surfaced in such jobs. The tank was old, its concrete walls brittle with hairline cracks, the stench clinging to his clothes and skin no matter how many times he washed. As the pump thudded and groaned, pulling the water down to a murky film, something pale and oddly shaped caught his eye, tangled among a clump of roots and rotting leaves that had somehow found their way inside. At first, he thought it was a scrap of cloth, but when his gloved hand reached in and pulled it free, he realized it was a tiny shoe, no larger than the length of his palm. The leather was cracked, its color long faded to a grayish tan, and the sole was brittle enough that a piece crumbled away at his touch. It had been wedged so deep in the debris that he wondered how it had survived there all these years. He wiped it clean as best he could on the hem of his shirt, staring at the faint stitched pattern along the sides, and felt an unease rise in his chest. Ramon had seen enough of the world to know when something was wrong, and this was not the kind of thing one simply threw away. He set it aside carefully and kept working, but the image of it would not leave his mind, the way the laces had fused into a single stiff knot, as if frozen in time. Later, when the local authorities arrived after his call, they placed the shoe into a clear evidence bag, their gloves making faint snapping sounds as they handled it with the care given to things that tell a story no one wants to hear. A week later, they confirmed it matched the description of the pair Arjun Tan had been wearing the summer he vanished in 1991, a fact that made Ramon's stomach tighten as though he had swallowed stones. He told Mei Lin that the moment he heard the boy's name, he remembered a poster that had hung for months in the window of a sari-sari store near his childhood home, the face of a smiling toddler staring out from behind the glass. Now, decades later, that same face was tied to a discovery pulled from the depths of a place meant to hide waste, a cruel metaphor for a life cut short. As Ramon finished his story, he looked past Mei Lin toward the street, where children in bright slippers chased a worn basketball, their laughter carrying over the rumble of passing tricycles, and his hands curled slowly into fists, as if he could somehow keep the world from swallowing another child whole. Mei Lin sat across from Suresh and Amina Tan in their small, time-worn living room, the scent of cardamom tea drifting from a pot that had been left to cool on the side table, untouched since her arrival. The couple looked smaller than their age suggested, their backs slightly bent, as if the years had not only weighed on them, but pressed them down into themselves. Family photographs lined the walls, most faded by sunlight. The colors washed into a soft blur, yet one picture on the mantel remained sharp and vivid, framed carefully behind clean glass. It was of a little boy with dark, curious eyes and a shy smile, wearing a pale blue shirt that seemed too big for his 3-year-old frame. Mei Lin asked gently about the summer of 1991, and the air seemed to shift, the way it does before a storm when the leaves hold still and the birds go quiet. Suresh's gaze fell to his hands, his fingers moving slowly over one another, as if they were counting something only he could see, while Amina's lips pressed into a thin line before she spoke. She told Mei Lin that the day Arjun vanished, they had gone to the police immediately, frantic and desperate, certain that every available officer would search until he was found. Instead, they were told to stay calm, to wait at home, to let the authorities handle it. When days passed without any sign of their son, they returned to the station, but were met with weary faces and clipped voices that urged them not to stir trouble in the community. Amina's voice trembled as she explained how their questions were met with warnings, subtle but sharp, that speaking too loudly could make their lives harder. Suresh admitted that he had considered going to the newspapers, but a neighbor pulled him aside one evening and told him it would be better for everyone if he let the matter rest. They tried to comply, telling themselves the police knew more than they were saying, that there must be reasons for their silence, but as weeks turned to months, hope began to thin like smoke in the wind. Mei Lin noticed how both of them spoke without looking at each other, as if the words still carried enough pain to be dangerous, even after so many years. Their house felt like a place where time had stopped, every object holding its position from the day their son disappeared, a quiet shrine to a moment that had never resolved. As Mei Lin thanked them for speaking with her, Amina reached for the teapot and poured a small cup, setting it in front of her guest with hands that trembled only slightly. She said there was nothing more they could give her, but the truth they had lived with, the truth they had been told to keep buried, and as Mei Lin lifted the cup to her lips, she tasted not only the spice and warmth of the drink, but the bitterness of a silence that had lasted for more than 3 decades. Mei Lin found Mrs. Celia Ong in a small bungalow at the end of a narrow lane, its walls softened by creeping jasmine and years of weather. The old woman welcomed her inside with the hesitant politeness of someone who had not entertained visitors in a long time, her thin frame moving slowly yet deliberately as she guided Mei Lin to a wicker chair by the window. Celia's eyes were clouded with age, but still held a sharpness beneath their surface, a watchfulness that suggested she had carried more memories than she had ever spoken aloud. When Mei Lin asked if she remembered the summer of 1991, Celia's fingers tightened around the chipped porcelain cup in her hands, her gaze drifting to the garden beyond the glass. She said she remembered it clearly, because the day Arjun vanished had been one of those hot afternoons where the air felt heavy and cicadas sang so loudly they seemed to drown out every other sound. She recalled seeing the boy in his grandmother's yard, chasing after a small red ball, before a shadow moved into view. It was Paulo Tan, a lanky teenager at the time, his expression unreadable as he lifted Arjun into his arms. Celia said she had thought little of it then, assuming Paulo was taking him inside for a drink of water or to escape the heat. But something about the way Paulo kept glancing over his shoulder lodged itself in her mind like a burr. She remembered the slight stiffness in his posture, the way his steps seemed too quick for the weight of the child he carried. Celia admitted that she had told no one back then, partly because she thought it must have been innocent, and partly because the Tans were a well-regarded family, and speaking against them would have drawn suspicion and trouble. When the news came that Arjun was missing, she felt a sharp stab of dread, but convinced herself that what she had seen could not have been connected. She lived with that quiet doubt for years, carrying it like a stone in her pocket, its weight small yet constant. Mei Lin listened without interruption, sensing that each word cost Celia something, like drawing water from a deep and reluctant well. The old woman's voice lowered when she admitted that Paulo had not been seen in the neighborhood for long after that summer, leaving suddenly to live with relatives in another province. She said no one ever explained why, and she had not asked, though the question had followed her through the years. As Mei Lin took notes, the air in the room felt thick with the past, every detail settling into place like pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight. When she left, Celia stood in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame, and told Mei Lin that she wished she had spoken sooner, because perhaps then the silence that had wrapped around the boy's disappearance might have been broken before it hardened into permanence. The police station smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of scent that seemed to cling to files untouched for decades, and Mei Lin felt it settle into her skin as she sat at a metal desk beneath the flicker of a weak fluorescent light. The officer on duty had been reluctant to grant her access to the archives, but after several minutes of measured persistence and the weight of her press credentials, she found herself leafing through the original case file on Arjun Tan's disappearance. The folder was thin for something tied to the loss of a child, its pages yellowed and edges frayed, as though time had worn away not just the paper, but the urgency that should have lived inside it. She scanned the statements, her pen tapping absently against her notebook, and quickly realized something was wrong. Several entries referenced witness accounts, yet none were included, as if voices had been promised but never committed to the record. The timeline was equally troubling, with long gaps unaccounted for on the day Arjun vanished, periods where no officer seemed to have been assigned to actively search. More unsettling still was the absence of any mention of Paulo Tan. His name did not appear even once, not in the list of individuals interviewed, not in any casual reference, nothing to suggest he had existed within the scope of the investigation. Mei Lin thought of Mrs. Celia Ong's quiet voice, of the image of Paolo carrying the boy toward the house, and felt her stomach twist with the knowledge that this detail had been erased before it had ever been written down. She wondered who had decided it was unimportant, or worse, who had deliberately kept it from the page. Her fingers lingered on the edge of a typed report that claimed no credible leads had emerged, the words printed in the same steady font that masked the uncertainty and human error behind them. The more she read, the more it felt like the file had been built to close a door rather than open it, its structure neat enough to give the appearance of thoroughness, yet hollow where it mattered most. She copied passages into her leather-bound journal, each note underscored with the uneasy truth that the investigation had been incomplete by design. The officer who had first handed her the file stood near the door, shifting his weight as if eager for her to finish, and Mei Lin could feel his eyes on her back. She closed the folder carefully, the paper whispering against itself, and asked if there were any supplementary records or field notes. His shrug was slow, his reply non-committal, and she knew then that she was unlikely to find more in this building. Still, as she stepped out into the bright glare of the afternoon, the case file under her arm, she felt a resolve settle in her chest like a stone in deep water. If the official record refused to hold the truth, she would build one of her own, piece by fragile piece. The afternoon heat pressed down on Mei Lin as she stood in the overgrown backyard of the old Tan property, her eyes tracing the warped lines of the house until they landed on a squat, windowless structure near the rear fence. The storage room looked like it had grown out of the ground itself, its wood darkened to nearly black from years of rain and sun, vines curling up the sides as if nature had tried to swallow it whole. She moved closer, her shoes crunching on gravel long faded to dust, and reached for the rusted padlock hanging from the latch. The metal was mottled with orange corrosion, the kind that comes only from decades of neglect, and when she tugged on it, it rattled against the door with a hollow finality. Through a narrow gap between the planks, she could see only darkness, the kind that seemed to hold its breath, concealing whatever it had guarded all these years. Mei Lin pressed her face closer, catching the faint scent of mildew and something sharper, almost metallic, and she pulled back, unsettled. She thought about the septic tank, about the shoe Ramon had described, about the details that kept leading her in circles around this property, as if it were holding its own map of secrets. The air was still, heavy with the smell of warm earth, and she could hear the hum of insects in the tall grass behind her. Kneeling, she inspected the base of the door, noticing deep scratches in the wood near the bottom hinge, not fresh, but not entirely erased by time either. They looked like marks left by someone desperate to force their way in or out, each gouge uneven, angled, hurried. Rising to her feet, she ran her hand along the frame, feeling the grit of dust on her fingertips, the way the grain seemed to shiver beneath her touch. The lock itself was old, but not original. The type sold in hardware stores in the late 1980s or early 1990s, and she wondered who had placed it there and why no one had removed it since. The current owners had told her they rarely ventured into the backyard, that they considered the storage shed unsafe because of its age. But she could tell from the path worn through the weeds that someone had been here often enough in the past. Mei Lin took several photos, each one framing the structure in different light, then stepped back to take in the entire scene. The shed crouched in shadow, while the rest of the yard lay in the full glow of the sun. There was a tension to it, a quiet defiance, as if it had been waiting for her. She knew she would need permission to cut the lock, perhaps even a warrant, but the weight of its presence made her certain it was not just another abandoned outbuilding. Whatever had been hidden here had been kept hidden for a reason, and she intended to find out why. When the locksmith finally twisted the last stubborn pin free and the rusted padlock fell open, Mei Lin pushed the storage room door with the caution of someone who knew she was stepping into the past. The air inside was damp and stale, as though it had been trapped for a lifetime, carrying the sour tang of mildew mixed with the faint, acrid scent of paper long neglected. The dim light from the doorway spilled over stacks of warped boxes, the sagging silhouettes of old furniture, and a dust-caked trunk shoved into the far corner. She moved carefully, her shoes stirring decades of grit, each step releasing a whisper of disturbed silence. Kneeling beside the trunk, she brushed away the cobwebs that clung to its brass latch and eased it open, the hinges groaning like a warning. Inside lay a jumble of brittle documents, yellowed envelopes, and a small notebook with a cover warped by water damage, its edges curled and darkened. The paper was soft under her fingertips, fragile as autumn leaves, and she opened it with care. The ink inside faded, but still legible in places. The handwriting was uneven, almost rushed, each line pressed so hard into the page that the words had left faint indentations. Flipping through the entries, she felt the unease grow in her chest. The first pages spoke of chores and school, ordinary things, but then the tone shifted into something stranger, more guarded. Phrases like keeping secrets and making sure no one talks appeared again and again, mingled with unsettling mentions of punishment and not letting him leave. The words were vague, yet chilling, their meaning sharpened by the knowledge of what had happened to Arjun. She turned another page and found a crude sketch of the town house, a small X marked near the backyard where the septic tank had been. The entry beneath it was smudged and almost illegible, as if someone had tried to rub it out, but the fragments she could read made her skin prickle. There was a mention of a night when it rained and he cried until it stopped, followed by a line about silence being the only way to fix it. Mei Lin closed her eyes for a moment, letting the oppressive stillness of the room press in around her. The journal balanced in her lap like a fragile piece of evidence that had been waiting for her alone. When she finally looked up, her gaze swept over the rest of the trunk, noting other objects beneath the pile, but the notebook in her hands felt heavier than any of them. She knew she would have to hand it over to the authorities, but for now, she slipped it gently into her bag, the musty scent of its pages lingering in the air as she stepped back into the sunlight. Behind her, the storage room stood open, its shadow spilling across the grass, the secrets inside finally beginning to seep into the light. The report from the coroner's office arrived in a sealed envelope, the kind that seemed heavier than paper should be, as if it carried the weight of everything the family had feared, and yet needed to know. Mei Lin sat at her small kitchen table with the blinds drawn, the afternoon light softened to a dim glow, and ran her thumb along the flap before opening it. The pages inside were clinical, the language detached, yet every sentence seemed to hum with the truth beneath the formality. The remains recovered from the septic tank were conclusively identified as belonging to Arjun Tan, the confirmation made through dental records and bone structure comparison. The phrasing was exact, stripped of emotion, but Mei Lin felt her chest tighten as her eyes moved to the next section. The report noted evidence that suggested the child had died before being placed in the tank, the absence of water in the lungs indicating no drowning, the fractures in small bones aligning more closely with blunt force trauma than with the natural processes of decay. The details were laid out in matter-of-fact lines, each one a quiet hammer blow, reconstructing a finality that had been suspended in uncertainty for nearly 2 decades. There was mention of soil particles on clothing fibers that did not match the immediate area of the septic tank, implying that he had been elsewhere before being moved, and an unusual concentration of certain plant seeds embedded in the fabric, a trace that could point investigators toward where those final moments happened. Mei Lin set the report down for a moment and pressed her hands to her face, the coolness of her palms doing nothing to steady the rolling heat of anger and sorrow. She thought of the photograph she had seen of Arjun, his round cheeks and bright eyes, the open, easy smile of a boy who had known only the small world of family yards and neighborhood streets. She thought of his parents, Suresh and Amina, waiting all these years with no grave to visit, no certainty to anchor their grief. Lifting the report again, she read through the remainder of the findings. The coroner's careful conclusion that the death was a homicide, though the exact circumstances remained undetermined until more evidence was brought forward. The words, "pending further investigation," were circled in red ink, a small but resolute mark from the detective assigned to the reopened case. Mei Lin let her gaze drift to the notebook she had found in the locked storage room, still resting on her desk, and she felt the cold certainty settle in her bones that the two discoveries were connected. Outside, the hum of the city seemed far away, muffled by the gravity of what she now knew. She closed the envelope, not to hide the truth, but to preserve its weight until she could place it in the hands of those who had been waiting far too long to hear it. The lead came quietly, almost as an afterthought, from a records clerk who had been helping Mei Lin sift through stacks of faded documents and brittle pages of old immigration logs. The air in the cramped municipal archive smelled faintly of dust and aged paper, and the light from the high windows fell in muted slants across the desk where she worked. It was there, between the smudged ink of arrival forms and the neat type of departure records, that a single entry stood out. Paulo Tan, 19 years old at the time, had boarded a flight from Manila to Kuala Lumpur in the autumn of 1992, just over a year after Arjun had vanished. There was no return stamp in the records, no sign he had ever come back, his trail dissolving into the distance like smoke fading into night. Mei Lin stared at the thin sheet of paper, the weight of the absence pressing harder than any tangible evidence, and she felt the old unease curl in her chest. She asked the clerk to double-check the database, to confirm there were no follow-up entries, and the man shook his head with a certainty born of years in the job. It was as though Paulo had stepped onto that plane and into another life, leaving behind only a ghost in the family history. She thought of Mrs. Celia Ong's recollection of seeing Paulo carry Arjun toward the house that day, the way her voice had trembled with the effort of remembering, and she could not ignore the sharp angle of coincidence that now seemed far too deliberate. She pictured a young man, restless and cornered, slipping away before questions could turn into accusations, the kind of departure that felt like both escape and erasure. The surrounding records painted a wider picture of the time, other families leaving in search of work or safety, but Paulo's case felt different, marked by the abruptness of his disappearance and the silence that followed. No postcards, no holiday visits, no mention of him in the family's sparse recollections when she had sat in their small living room sipping tea. It was as if his name had been wrapped in a blanket and hidden in the attic of their memory, left to gather dust where no one dared to touch it. Mei Lin traced the date with her fingertip, the paper warm under her skin from the light streaming through the window, and she wondered whether Paulo's absence was born of guilt or fear, or perhaps both entwined so tightly that neither could be told apart. Outside, the afternoon traffic hummed in a low, constant rhythm, a reminder that life moved forward regardless of the truths buried in its path. She folded the document carefully, slipping it into her leather satchel, and felt the pull of the next step in the search. Somewhere, beyond the borders drawn in ink on a map, Paulo was either living under another name or lying in another unmarked grave, and in both cases, the shadow of Arjun's small figure walked beside him. The discovery came late in the evening, when the municipal archive had grown quiet enough for Mei Lin to hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above her and the occasional shuffle of papers from another room. She had been poring over brittle manila folders, their labels fading into a muted yellow, when she unfolded a stack of photocopied bank statements dating back to the early 1990s. The columns of numbers marched neatly down the page, most of them modest deposits and withdrawals typical of an ordinary household, until one entry caught her attention like a shard of glass in a stream. It was a transfer, large enough to stand out even by today's standards, made to an account in Paolo Tan's name, just 2 weeks after the day Arjun vanished. The sum was followed by another of similar size a month later, and then a third, after which Paolo's account activity abruptly dwindled until his departure from the country in 1992. At the bottom of one transaction slip was a faint notation, almost smudged beyond recognition, that mentioned a land sale under the name of Ernesto Tan, Arjun's grandfather. Mei Lin's fingers lingered on the ink, as if she could draw the truth from its faded lines, her mind shaping the possible exchange into something far more deliberate than coincidence. She imagined the weight of those banknotes, the way they could tilt the balance of loyalty or silence in a family already treading the edge of something unspeakable. The records painted a picture not of random misfortune, but of an agreement, the kind that hid itself in plain sight behind the cold impartiality of numbers. She could almost see Paolo standing in a dimly lit bank, the echo of the teller's stamp sealing something that was meant to remain buried. Her chest tightened as she thought of the quiet grief she had seen in Suresh and Amina Tan's eyes, and she wondered whether they had known of these transactions, or if the truth had been kept from them too. The idea that a child's life could be entangled with the sale of land, a plot that might once have held family gatherings or mango trees heavy with fruit, made the air in the archive feel heavier. Outside, the last light of day pressed against the dusty window, its glow dim and strained, as though the world itself hesitated to look too closely. Mei Lin copied the details onto the pages of her leather-bound notebook, each number and date like a stone added to the growing weight of evidence. The path ahead felt narrower, the walls closing in, yet she sensed she was finally circling the heart of the story. Money had a way of leaving footprints, even when people tried to walk without making a sound. And here, in the faded ink of decades-old bank records, those footprints seemed to lead straight to the moment everything had gone wrong. It was a grey morning when Mei Lin stepped off the curb outside the provincial police headquarters, the air thick with the scent of impending rain, and saw the unmarked van roll through the gates with 2 uniformed officers in the front. The side door slid open with a muted thud, and a man stepped out slowly, his posture neither defiant nor submissive, but carrying the weariness of someone who had been watching the years accumulate without outrunning them. Paolo Tan, now in his mid-40s, looked older than the photographs she had studied, his hair streaked with silver, and his face marked by the kind of lines carved by sun and worry. He wore a plain, wrinkled shirt that seemed a size too big, and as he glanced around, his eyes flickered with a guarded calculation, taking in the building, the officers, and the small knot of onlookers who had gathered despite the quiet nature of the return. He had been found in a modest apartment above a shop in Kuala Lumpur, living under his own name, but far enough from the Philippines to avoid the pull of unfinished business, until an international request for cooperation brought him back. Mei Lin watched as the officers led him inside, their hands resting lightly at his elbows, not as a show of force, but as a reminder of where he was and why. She followed at a measured pace, her recorder ready in her bag, though she doubted he would speak freely to a journalist just yet. In the corridor, the sound of footsteps and murmured instructions echoed off the whitewashed walls, each step tightening the air around them. Paolo's expression was difficult to read, his mouth a neutral line, but his eyes held the kind of restless movement that spoke of rehearsed answers and calculations about what to reveal. Mei Lin thought of the notebook she had found in the locked storage room, the unsettling phrases about keeping secrets and punishment, and the bank transfers that had turned from faded numbers on a page into something solid and unavoidable. Rain began to patter against the narrow windows, the drops sliding down in crooked paths, blurring the view of the courtyard outside. As they reached the interview room, Paolo hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping in, as if standing at the edge of a place he had long avoided in dreams. The officers closed the door behind him, and for a moment, The hallway felt still, the sounds muffled as though the building itself was holding its breath. Mei Lin knew this was only the beginning of what would unfold. But the sight of Paolo sitting at a table under the harsh light, the years of absence now collapsed into this single room, gave her the sense that the story had finally reached a point where the past could no longer hide in the corners. The conference room was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and paper when Mei Lin took her seat across from the lead investigator, the blinds drawn just enough to filter the late afternoon light into narrow bands across the table. A manila folder sat between them, its edges worn from repeated handling, and when it was opened, the story inside seemed to unfold in slow, deliberate pieces, like a photograph developing in a dark room. The investigator spoke in a low, steady tone, explaining that the motive they had pieced together was both simple and brutal in its logic. Paolo Tan, still a teenager in 1991, had been told by his grandfather that he would inherit a prime stretch of farmland near the town's edge, land that had been in the family for generations. But when whispers began that Arjun's name might be placed ahead of his in the will, everything shifted. Paolo, they believed, had watched his place in the family's future narrow until it was barely a sliver, the promise of the land slipping further from reach with every conversation behind closed doors. The investigator tapped a photocopy of an old handwritten note, the ink faded but legible, in which Paolo's grandfather mentioned his intention to ensure the boy will have a secure start. It was not proof on its own, but when combined with the bank records showing sudden deposits to Paolo's account after the disappearance and the statements from neighbors who recalled tension in the household, the picture became clearer. Mei Lin could almost see it in her mind, the way envy and fear might coil together in a young man's chest, tightening until they drove him toward choices that could never be undone. The investigator's voice remained calm, but there was a strain beneath it, the kind that comes from carrying the weight of what people are capable of doing to their own blood. He said that greed often came dressed as desperation, and desperation could look a lot like love twisted out of shape. Mei Lin's pen moved slowly over her notebook, the words she wrote forming a map of the tragedy that had unfolded decades ago, each detail a stone in the path leading to that summer afternoon. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and for a moment it felt as if the air in the room thickened with the memory of a child's absence, the silence he left behind, settling into every corner. Paolo had never confessed, the investigator reminded her, and perhaps never would, but the motive they had uncovered was as close to a confession as they might ever get. It was not the kind of answer that eased grief, but it was a shape for the shadow that had hung over the Tan family for so long. As Mei Lin closed her notebook, she felt the truth settle into her like a stone dropped into deep water, heavy and unmovable, the ripples from it still spreading across the years. The lake was still beneath the velvet sweep of night, its surface mirroring the pinprick lights of distant stars, and along the shore a quiet crowd had gathered, their silhouettes softened by the warm glow of paper lanterns cradled in their hands. Mei Lin stood slightly apart, her notebook closed for once, watching as Suresh and Amina Tan stepped forward to the water's edge, their faces drawn yet calm in a way that spoke of exhaustion and release. In Amina's hands was a single lantern, its delicate frame trembling in the breeze, the thin paper sides painted with Arjun's name in careful strokes, the ink slightly smudged from her touch. The murmur of the crowd faded as Suresh lit the candle inside, the flame flickering before catching, sending a golden pulse through the paper that seemed to breathe in time with the night. Mei Lin thought of how the lake had been here for centuries, how it had reflected both joy and grief, its patient waters swallowing secrets, yet offering a place to set them free. As the lantern was lowered to the surface, the flame wavered, but did not falter, and the ripples carried it outward, the glow growing smaller and softer until it was just a distant ember floating toward the dark horizon. A hush settled over the vigil, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the shore and the sigh of the wind moving through the trees, a sound that felt almost like words, too quiet to catch. Mei Lin's eyes lingered on the way Amina's fingers clung to the edge of Suresh's sleeve, a silent anchor, and the way his gaze never left the drifting light, as though he could will it to carry their son's spirit to a place beyond hurt. She thought of the years they had carried this weight, the unanswered questions that had worn them down like water smoothing stone, and how tonight, even without every detail accounted for, they had chosen to let something go. More lanterns joined Arjun's, scattering across the water until the lake looked like the sky had tipped over, stars resting on its surface. The air smelled faintly of wax and smoke, and somewhere behind her, someone began to hum a soft melody, the kind of tune a parent might use to lull a child to sleep. Mei Lin felt a pressure in her chest, the kind that comes when witnessing something both unbearably sad and profoundly beautiful, and she knew she would carry this image with her long after her notes and recordings were filed away. As the last trace of Arjun's lantern slipped from sight, a final ripple broke against the shore, and Suresh whispered something only Amina could hear. Whatever it was, it made her close her eyes and bow her head, the night folding around them like a promise that the truth, at last, was no longer wandering, but had found its place to rest.